Good afternoon, everyone. So welcome to the online event that is the Design Lecture 3. This design lecture is a part of our design competition series, Design Advance. So following are the program details. So we'll have first the welcome mood by Chakre sir, then Dr. Iftekhaar Ahmed, then Dr. Manu Gupta. So they'll be presenting on the topic, their relevant topic, and then we'll share the details for BIM for Design and BIM program. And post that, we'll have the Q&A session. So I request everyone to please write your questions in the Q&A box, which is available on your screen. And then we'll have the voter fees by Chakre. So starting on, Mr. Jain is the chairman of board at Capricot Technologies Private Limited, and he did architecture from IIT Kharagpur and started his AutoCAD training and consultancy just after graduation. He was initially focused on application of CAD in architectural design, but soon moved into partnership with Autodesk and expanded into software solutions for entire building and infrastructure industry in the name of CAD Studio. So over to you, Chakre sir.
Thank you, Farah. Share my screen. Let me know once my screen is visible.
Yes, sir, it's visible.
Welcome everyone, and thank you for participation. And I like to especially thank Iftekhaar Ahmed. We were classmates at IIT Kharagpur. We were studying together, and we spent some lovely memories in Kharagpur for 5 years. And then, of course, Manu Gupta, another architect who, of course, is very well known in India for the work he does under his organization Seeds. And today we are very eager to hear from them. So I'll not take much time. I'll just try to keep my discussion to minimum 2-3 minutes. So we as an organization has been now supporting the entire construction industry with technology solutions for more than 3 decades. And with all that effort today, we are serving more than 20,000 customers across the country. And we are, of course, Autodesk partner, and we are governed by 4 board members. And while working with Autodesk, we also realized that there are some other complementary solutions we need to bring in amongst a practice. And we accordingly tied up with like Adobe and many other related things. I'll not get into too much detail of that. So coming more specifically to this today's event is that when last year we had a sudden lockdown announced, and there was a huge challenge with migration, migrant workers. So we as an organization thought that how can we contribute towards that? And that's where this genesis of this competition came in, and we announced this competition, and this is still going on, and it's still open to the students to register by 11th June. And they can submit by 25th June, and then we will be announcing the final awards on 16th of July. So, so of course, we don't have the definite number, but more than 10 million workers were especially a lot of them from the construction were migrating, and they started walking down to that. So it kind of highlighted this issue of what a lot of people have been also calling as invisible people. There are so many people who been serving the country, but they are kind of not so visible in the media or any of them. They do that. So therefore we call them, these are the people who are kind of nowhere people. They don't come so much active in any of our current thought process and discussion. And we wanted to bring them center stage, and that's why we are calling this competition as from nowhere to now here people. So we need to really do something, and that's a huge chunk of our country. And therefore we thought that we'll have a competition that how can we create respectable and livable spaces which is resilient and of course effective for them. So, and while we announced this competition, we also realized that we need to give a lot of issues around this. What are the issues from some of the, like what we have today from Dr. Iftekhar and Dr. Manu, and that's why we ran a series of design lectures. And in fact, in one of them, famous architect Moshe Safdie also was gracious enough to present his thoughts around housing. And today we have, and simultaneously, we are also running some technical workshops. And for the participants, anyone interested, please keep a track of this and do attend these things. So in the competition, we already have more than 340 students team who have registered for that, and we still have it open. So we'd like to see more and more participation, and then we'll put it all together and try and share this entire, all the efforts students are putting in this. So I'll not take much time, and with that, I like to pass on back to Farhad.
Thank you, Chakresa, for highlighting the design competition. I'm sure a lot of students are already working on their designs day and night and will soon see the results. So I'll just share my screen again. Okay. So our next speaker is Dr. Iftekhaar Ahmed. So Dr. Iftekhaar Ahmed is an associate professor and previous program convener of the Master of Disaster Resilience and Sustainable Development, University of Newcastle, Australia. He teaches social and policy aspects of disaster risk reduction, resilience of the built environment, and sustainable development. His research interests include post-disaster housing, disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation, and urbanization in the Asia Pacific. He has written several books and many peer-reviewed publications and engages in various research and evaluation projects relating to disaster resilience. So over to you, sir. I'll just stop sharing my screen.
Okay, good afternoon, good evening for me, and greetings from Newcastle. You can see our beautiful city behind me in Australia. So I will start sharing my screen and then we could discuss more in detail. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes, sir.
Yes, that is very good. Okay, so I will talk a little bit about housing reconstruction today. I will give you a broad brush overview of this project, of this field. What Chakresh, and Chakresh is my good classmate and friend from a very long time, and he requested me that we have this competition, and students need to get, or participants rather, need to get, students and participants both need to get an idea of this kind of socially responsive approach and dealing with some of the important challenges that we face, confronted with in the world, and disasters, of course, is one of them. And what Chakresh also mentioned about the COVID pandemic having this impact on people, and particularly the segment of population which constitutes the majority not only of India but of the whole world, really. So trying to focus on this population group and what can architects really do, what kind of areas. So I will be focusing on just a slice of the very larger pie, if I may say so. So before that, just to give you a very quick overview, I know Mr. Farhad gave a little introduction of myself, and just to tell you a little bit about, these are some of the publications that you might be interested in looking as a follow-up from this discussion. And this is a book, Sustainable Housing Reconstruction. It was based on case studies from 6 different countries, both developed and developing countries. And and then some of these other books. The first one on community engagement, post-disaster recovery, it covered 13 countries and 5 continents. We could not eventually capture South America because of language barriers, but eventually we tried to get a broad brush understanding of this field. And then again, like I mentioned right at the beginning, I particularly, and the people I work with, we are, and relating to the theme of the competition, is that we are concerned with these people who are disadvantaged, people who are vulnerable to disaster impacts and all kinds of the impacts, and also there is advantage because of socioeconomic inequality around the world. So I think this community engagement is a very important area. And as I talk today, you will see how this kind of theme unfolds in the work that I'll be discussing. This is a recent one, which also was published last year, Disaster Resilience in South Asia. We're looking at 5 countries though, and Fortunately, unfortunately, whatever we say, India was not included in this book because we argued that the smaller countries around India, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, Maldives, Sri Lanka, these are much more vulnerable because they have less resource and less capacity. So which is why we focused on these smaller countries. So enough of that, I think, for now. So going back to the sector housing, post-disaster housing, and it is arguable, it's very hard to get right statistics, but this is a very good one, which was done after the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. And this was taken from Aceh in Indonesia, where the different sectors in terms of damage and loss were compared. And as you can see here, that the housing sector experienced much more damage, far exceeding all the other sectors, as you can see that. So this is one area, and every time you see a disaster, like especially rapid onset disasters such as earthquakes and cyclones, you see the impact on housing. It's so vivid. It's portrayed by the media, often sensationalized, but it is really a serious area. So that is what it is. And just to look at this process of how people actually shelter themselves. And again, with the segment of population that I was highlighting before in mind. And if you look at before the disasters, people build and they extend, they upgrade houses, and they do all kinds of things by themselves, local labor, self-help. And people often don't build a house at one go because they often don't have the resources, and sometimes they don't have the need. As their family, extended families grow, they build up and add things. And then if the disaster strikes, then again, they follow the same kind of process. Again, they'll start upgrading, improving, and doing the same kind of thing. So, so this kind of situation, emergency response, it should support this kind of process by providing something beyond what households can do by themselves. And there's also this whole element of self-recovery. Of course, people are resilient, people are capable in many countries, which is often not recognized, and that has to be supported instead of supplanted. So this is what it is, the self-recovery. This is what I told you. In many countries, a colleague of mine, actually a former student of mine from Bangladesh, she did a study on self-recovery after Cyclone Sidir in Bangladesh, 2007. And what she found is that almost 60% of the households had initiated some form of self-recovery by themselves before the NGOs and other organizations, humanitarian organizations could arrive and help them. So, and then so self-recovery, and then the organizations come in with the emergency shelter provision, and then starts the early recovery. And early recovery, the earlier you can start recovery, the better it is. The longer you wait, it gets more difficult because people would have to find some form of accommodation anyway. And this applies across the world, really. And then finally you go to your recovery, and then we start calling it housing, no longer shelter, because we are looking at something much more permanent. So I just want to touch a little bit on this kind of notion of product versus process. In the product approach, you might have tents, and this is at the emergency stage, and then you might have containers as transitional form of housing, and then finally the house. This is the product approach. Now, just to give an idea, a tent in a developing country, a global south country like India, can be very expensive. And they often don't produce it locally. They may have to have it shipped in from abroad. So there's this embodied cost of energy as well. And the process approach is somewhat different. You start providing support, you give them training, you give them toolkit, you give them cash, and guidance through training manuals and training programs and materials and tools. And so this approach has started shifting. If you go back to about 20 years ago, this is what people were doing, the humanitarian organizations, but this is increasingly what they've been trying to do now. And they have learned from mistakes. The culturally inappropriate ways of doing things have given lessons to many organizations throughout the world, particularly after the major disasters such as the Indian Ocean tsunami, which gave a whole range of lessons that you cannot do things, without the right kind of technical competence really behind it. So now I will talk very briefly about the different forms of emergency and transitional shelter. And you may ask me, where is that photo from? Now that photo was taken, I took that photo in Haiti in 2013, 3 years after the massive earthquake in 2010. And at that time, these are what they call transitional shelters, but you can see that they are actually wrapped with tents. The tents were provided as emergency shelter, and they kept on having them. So this 3 years down the road, and people were still living in these accommodations. And I can imagine that much of them had consolidated into shanty towns over time without. So you see the difficulties with transitional shelter, and this actually brings me to the different stages, which I talked about, the product approach, that there's an emergency stage when people are given temporary accommodation of typically tents. And this can happen even in conflict situations, as well as natural disasters arising from natural hazards. And then there's the transitional stage, and you can see some of these photos that are taken. This photo was taken from Sri Lanka more than 5 years after the Indian Ocean tsunami. And then finally move on to your permanent. All of these photos are from Sri Lanka, actually. And so I can keep going about this, but let's just go on. So what really happens is that it can take months to years. Sometimes it's years for people getting back to their feet in permanent housing. And so there are many kinds of temporary shelter options. Firstly, it could be like no physical shelter is provided. People are supported to get accommodation with friends, families, hotels, even rentals. Some of this happens in countries like Australia. Recently, in April this year, we had massive floods in New South Wales in the state. And the temporary accommodation largely consisted of people getting vouchers to stay in hotels for short term. And then you might have in situ temporary shelter, and then congregate temporary. Congregate means like, it, not staying on their own site, but having these camps basically. And finally, the facility conversion. It's like you convert buildings. You can see these photographs from Bangladesh. And this photograph was taken after a flood, massive flood in 2004, when these schools were converted for temporary accommodation. So people were just staying there temporarily, but you can see that these people were staying in these shelters for extended durations, more than months. So just to give you a few examples of case studies. So this is an example from Indonesia and the transitional shelter example that I talked about. And as I was highlighting in the case of Haiti, that this notion of transitional shelter is problematic, and because in some cases agencies provide transitional shelter and then they leave because they don't have resources, understandably, to provide anything more than that kind of short-term support. And those transitional shelters eventually become permanent shelters. They never go away. They're not transitional. They actually become permanent shelters. So there are different approaches to this issue. Is that in this particular case in Yogyakarta, what they did was they provided some kind of shelter with the resources that they had to allow people to upgrade them over time, and to salvage all materials they can see in this particular transitional shelter built, I think it was IOM, that they had built the foundation for it, and the plinth and some low walls, which they could slowly start extending and make proper brick walls. And they salvaged a lot of these bricks and the roofing tiles from damaged buildings and reused them. But interestingly, you see the photograph next to it, is that is the permanent house that they built, and that was a transition shelter, but they never got rid of it. Originally, when you ask our agencies, they thought, okay, once it's done, they'll use it as scrap. They might just use the timber for firewood and things like that. But in this particular case, they actually kept it. And you can start understanding in communities like this, every resource counts. Nothing is really wasted. People hang on to things for a very, very long time and try to nurture it and take care of it, and make it last for a very, very long time. Not in so-called Western countries where you dispose things very quickly and move on. So that is what. So they used it as a kitchen, and I think the granny actually, you can see the lady, she actually stayed in that, and so it was a multi-purpose space as well. So this kind of gives you an idea of how people with lower incomes use these spaces as it's a multi-purpose space, how they actually prolong the longevity of resources. and taking very good care of it. And I'm just giving you a comparative example from Australia. And this was a massive bushfires in 2009. And so there were these temporary villages, which were like a medium-term solution. People stayed in these temporary villages. I'll show you some photographs in the next slides, that they stayed there for about 1.5 years. And these were provided with all kinds of facilities, dining halls, kitchens, etc. They even had an area to keep pets. And pets are very important for people in Australia and many other Western countries, and perhaps even in India to some extent. And even playgrounds for kids. And so people could actually, and this was built close to the towns which were affected. There were 3 towns where they built it: Marysville, Kinglake, and Whittlesea. And people could stay close to their towns, and they could look at the construction work going on of the reconstruction of their houses while they could stay in the temporary camps. The kids could go back to school, and the health clinics were all there, and they were supported by Building Advisory Service. So this was an ad hoc organization that was put together by secondmen from different government bureaus. After the temporary phase passed, they were all gone. They went back to their own organizations. And so this kept on, and then this kept the community together. They just didn't disperse and move elsewhere. They stay near the community. And then this is actually a good case study. And you'll find this case study in that book I mentioned, Sustainable Housing Reconstruction, at the beginning. And then the other thing is that they started adapting. And even though I mentioned in many Western countries they get rid of things, they did not. In this particular case in Marysville, one of the villages, they used it as a school camp. In fact, when I did my field work, I actually stayed in that school camp to interview people. So it was still there after many years. So here you can see the photos. That's the temporary village in Kinglake, one of the towns. This was an open piece of land, and the farmer leased that land for a short period. And so all these kind of, small units were built. They call them granny flats here. A granny flat, if I may explain, if you don't know it, in some states, if you have extra land, then you can buy these small houses or you can build them in your backyard. And they call it a granny flat because maybe the grandmother can stay together with the family. So that's how, but people also use that as income. So they just got these granny flats and build these. You can see, and that is the school camp that I mentioned in Marysville. And what is interesting with this project, they have the playground, but here they have a barbecue stand, which was built by the architecture students of Monash University. So they actually contributed and went and they did the construction work by themselves. They designed these spaces and they used it. So you can see how young people and students can participate in these projects. This is just an example. So now we come to housing. I've just given you an overview of the temporary stage. And so again, I won't go into this in great detail. Basically, there are 2 forms of funding for development and in so-called global South countries. And so there's the humanitarian funding window, which just goes on all the time. And then once there's a disaster, then the humanitarian funding window starts kicking in. And then over some 6 to 3 months, again, development funding may resume. And so then you have the different stages, you provide the relief and medicines, tents and food and all that stuff. And then you go to the early recovery stage, and I showed you an earlier diagram, and then you go to medium long-term recovery, and then you go to development, the transition to long-term and hopefully sustainable development. And this can take up to 5 years. If you're lucky, it's 1 year, but it's usually not. It can take a long time. So, sorry, wrong one. Okay, now if you look at this, and this is a very quick snapshot of what really happens in this recovery or reconstruction process, is that at the beginning there's a disaster and you feel heroic and people help each other and they just kind of say, oh, we survived and we are okay now. And then there's a honeymoon stage when you feel that I'm going to get normal and all the agencies have been visiting us and they're promising all kinds of things. And then the disappointment, frustration, and anger and all that starts happening. The dispute with insurance agencies, the red tape in getting the funds released, the agreements and all that. And then the loss of support happens, the government lose interest or the organization lose interest, some other thing, other crises happen and they move on, and then people get completely exhausted. and the community starts getting fragmented with all the delays, obstacles, and finally you get your reconstruction, 1 to 3 years, maybe up to 5 years. Now, just to give you an idea, that in Australia, we had massive bushfires at the end of 2019 and early 2020, Black Summer bushfires, as they call it. And even now, the recovery is happening. People are still at this stage. So complete recovery doesn't happen. So this is a so-called affluent country. So you can imagine in global South countries how difficult it could be in mobilizing resources and kind of surmounting these obstacles. So just to give you a very quick definition is that getting people back to normal, and we could also repair damaged buildings, or you could help people rent existing buildings. So there are all kinds of ways to get into recovery. And then, of course, construction of permanent, durable solutions that reduce future disaster risk. That is very important. You can see this photograph. This is taken from Sri Lanka. It's an organization called Foundation of Goodness. And they built these 2-story houses after the Indian Ocean tsunami because people were scared that this is still coastal because the tsunami penetrated kilometers inland. And so even though this is quite a few kilometers, I think it's about 8 to 10 kilometers inland, but even then people were scared because they had a very traumatic experience, and rightly so if there's another tsunami. So to reduce risk, they built these 2-story houses. So these are duplexes, so one on each side, as you can see, and joined together. This is a great project, and I've written about it in different ways. It's called Foundation of Goodness. So anyway, so I need to move on a bit faster, I think. How much time do I have? I've got another 10 minutes. Okay, so these are the 3 different types: owner-driven, or the community can take a project, or the agency can do it, and the advantages and disadvantages of both of these. I won't go into great detail, except that just to say the owner-driven reconstruction is a high degree of control, and also the different forms. But if you look at the owner-driven approach, that people are given support and they just build by themselves, you see that there's got many advantages, and particularly because they're happy with the kind of space that they've and the kind of decision that they have, design decisions that they've taken, because it's in their control. And keys of disadvantages: it is hard to monitor, things can get sold off, and they may not have the right capacity and the skills, so it's balanced. And then they can be a mixture of both of these. In this particular project that I'm showing in Sri Lanka, again, this was a project by CARE, the international NGO. And this particular case, the householders could supervise the construction. They could come and see what was going on, and they could incorporate small changes in the design. For example, they included these fan lights. They wanted a bit more light inside the houses, so those could be accommodated. So in this particular case, even the organization and both the organization and the beneficiaries, they could feel that they were part of the whole project, and they had a sense of ownership. So there are different levels of engagement. You look at these projects, UN Habitat, Sri Lanka. This is also owner-driven, but agency provided the designs and supervision. This is Cordade in Haiti, and actually the video we just shown at the beginning of the work by Build Change, they were also involved in this project, and they incorporated earthquake risk construction, the recovery work. Or in Bangladesh, again, building products were given, and they were given technical support, and people build their own houses. Just to give you some examples, United States, if you go to a so-called developed country, there are different examples. They had to raise, again, to reduce risk, elevate the houses. And this is a new musicians village. It was a affordable housing project. And then this is a very interesting project. It was called Make It Right, funded by the famous actor Brad Pitt. But they had many problems, and all the famous architects of the world were involved: Shigura Ban and Van Grary, and you name them. Everyone left their mark here. But eventually these houses were unaffordable, and they had all kinds of other issues. So I will just give you a little example of a project where I was the shelter specialist in Bangladesh. And very quickly, it was a family shelter project, 16,000 houses. And some of the things that was done, and I can show you a very small video clip which explains the project.
In the same way, in the family shelter or the house reconstruction program, we have tried to introduce techniques which would ensure risk reduction or make these houses less vulnerable to next floods.
Floods swallow up people's lives and livelihood. With their houses drowned, people take refuge on high roads, dams, or flood shelters. After the floods subside, a lot of them cannot find their houses since they have been washed away. To make sure that the houses of the people whose lives are already difficult do not get washed away by the floods, in various project areas model houses have been built. Risk reduction aspects of the model houses are cement stabilized earthen plinth, concrete footing, katla, bamboo treatment, and rainwater gutter. Treatment of bamboos is one of the distinguishing features of this project. This protects the bamboo from insect attack and rotting. For the footing of the bamboo posts, the katla is made through local initiative. A soil and cement combination in the ratio of 19:1 was used for capping the plinth of the house. This prevents the plinth from being washed away.
ঘরটা খুব সুন্দর হয়েছে বুঝছে ঘরটা বন্যা এলেও ভাঙব না
Rainwater gutter made of split PVC pipes are used to prevent rainwater falling from roof eaves and damaging the lower part of the house. It also provides an alternative supply of arsenic-free water for household use. 16,036 houses were built in 23 districts under the housing project for the flood-stricken people. The houses differ in shape and structure in different areas depending on the quality of soil and easy availability of the materials. In some areas, instead of katla and bamboo, concrete pillars made of rods and cement is used. Again, in some areas, instead of bamboo fences, metal sheet is used. No matter what material is used, it is made sure that the houses are resistant to flooding. Certain criteria is set before nominating the people who are eligible to get the houses. The chairman of Village Development Council plays an important role in this regard.
যাকে ঘরটা দেওয়া আছে তার ঘরটা ধুসে গেছে গা তার ঘর তোলা কোনো সমর্থ নাই সে বিধবা তাকে আমার ঘরটা সমর্থন করিয়া তাকে নির্মাণ করে দেওয়া হইতেছে
আমার স্বামী মারা যাওয়ার পরে আমি অনেক দুঃখ কষ্ট করছি আমি একটা ঘর বেগরও থাকার পাই নাই আমার ভাইয়ের রান্নাঘরত থাকছি তারপরে আর বছর একটা সুনের ঘর আছিল ভাঙতে পরে বন্যা ভেঙে নিয়ে গেছে সবাই মিলে আমাকে একটা ঘর দিছে আমি কোনোদিনও ভাবিনি যে আমার এত সুন্দর একটা ঘর হবে
Right, that was a very quick clip. You can see the before pictures, how people were staying. And it may seem very modest houses, but a significant improvement in the quality of housing. This is what they were building and this is what they were getting. So a bit more durable, bit more, it's not a permanent house in that sense. Different kinds of houses built in different areas. So I won't go into in great detail. There were problems also with this project, and there are critical issues with beneficiary selection, and there were all kinds of quality control issues also. I had to go to all the sites and supervise all the construction, and some of the NGOs that implemented the project, they were also trying to cut corners. So it's not easy in a country like that. So the long-term impacts, and eventually, as you can see, that project serves as a stepping stone. And these people, they could build very large houses, and 10 years down the road, they had moved to a level of prosperity. So that kind of asset provision at that time helped them to move on to a long-term position of resilience. I won't go into all the projects because I don't really have time, right? I have about a few minutes. So I will skip some of these examples. That's also a similar example in Bangladesh. Long-term issues, you can see some of these issues like happening in Indonesia, that people start extending, rebuilding their houses. If there are two houses, the brothers join them and make them one house, or that is the original house. They've made extensions so much in exceeding the original house. You can see the drawings that we did in this particular project, that was the original house. The red color is the extensions that they built. And there were cultural issues also in this, in the way they use toilets. Same in the Maldives, we started looking at that. They built all these houses. So they often have this one size fits all approach. And this, please try to avoid it, you participant students. This one size fits all approach, try to have flexibility so that people can do their own things. In this particular case, they had fish processing as an important livelihood generating activity, and there was no space. So they had to go outside and start building those little stoves. And these are the extension. You can see the original house. That's the original house. They made it 2 stories. They started making a little restaurant in front. So all kinds of issues start happening. It's just not easy. There's a project in India, in Chennai, walk-ups built for fisher folk by the Slum Clearance Board. And there were many issues. A very, very small house, 22 square meters. So you can see the photograph. It's just one room and impossible for large families to live there. And many of these were sold off, and or they were renting out, and people went back to their fishing communities on the coast. So some of the key lessons that can come from these projects: firstly, housing has to be integrated with community infrastructure. It's not just building houses, but it's this whole gamut of supports and services. And particularly livelihoods, very important. Every time there's a disaster, you go to a community and ask them what you need. We need to get our jobs back. And it's both in global South and global North countries. And sustained engagement, that example that I gave you from Sri Lanka Foundation of Goodness, it's not a fly-in, fly-out organization. They started there after the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, as they have stayed with the community and supporting it for a long-term development process. Multi-stakeholder engagement is just not architects doing it, but architects working with others and engineers and all kinds of multidisciplinary people coming in, and as well as the communities who influence the design process. Okay, so I won't go into all of them. The main message which I want to give to you is to be able to build back better, build back safer, add that extra little bit so that the buildings can resist. And some of the examples I gave you tried to do that. The struts at the corners, or raising it above the water level in flooding or tsunami prone areas. And if I can show this, a very quick one, just to wrap it up, I'll just show you a small video clip from the United Nations.
In the aftermath of a disaster, a robust recovery plan that puts the needs of communities first will ensure minimal disruption and save lives. Pre-assigning resources and operational tasks before a disaster takes place will ensure that reconstruction can begin as soon as possible. Community needs following a disaster must be immediately attended to. Clearing stricken areas provides an opportunity for thorough reassessment of risks and to build back better and more resilient. Integrating disaster risk reduction and community improvement measures into the rebuilding process helps communities in the short term, as well as reducing future vulnerabilities. Together, we're building a more resilient world.
Right, so I will stop here. Thank you very much for your time. And I had to rush through some of these issues very quickly, but if you have any questions or comments, you can post them on the chat box and I can respond to them. So thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. So that was a really nice presentation. And I really like that approach which you mentioned, that product or a process approach. And I personally feel that I think in India, even the government, they go with the product approach, and now I got to know why we are facing a lot of problem. So I'm sure the students can, get help from your studies, and we'll share the recording also, so they can get the idea, and maybe they can orient their design and make it even much better. So, okay, I'll just share my screen to invite our next speaker. Okay, our next speaker is Dr. Manu Gupta. So Mr. Manu Gupta is co-founder of Seeds, a non-for-profit organization that enables community resilience through practical solutions in the areas of disaster readiness, response, and rehabilitation. He has 26 years of experience in the sector, spanning national and regional advocacy, mobilization of the community-led efforts in recovery and risk reduction, climate change adaptation, and emerging issues such as humanitarian partnerships and accountability. Mr. Manu has worked with a wide spectrum of communities across Asia. In recognition of his tireless efforts, he has been recently elected as an Ashoka Fellow. So over to you, Manusa. I'll just stop sharing the screen.
Thank you very much, Farah. And I have a very uphill task after hearing such an accomplished academician, my friend Iftekhar, who has really covered all the issues very well. So I can only add few little bits of some experiences that can add to this vast knowledge that is already there and so well presented by Iftekhar. And I think we will really gain by the insights that he provides, having such a wide canvas view. Let me take a few minutes to just set things on perspective and to try and give you why as practitioners, and I'm assuming I'm speaking mostly to young students or young professionals who are out there and who may be wanting to understand this from a practice perspective. And all I can say is, we are living in a new normal, and this new normal we can very well relate to, given the current pandemic, about the situation that Chakresh spoke about, the migrants, the people who have been displaced due to economic lockdown. How do we address, as architects, as engineers, as professionals, how do we address their needs? But also, while we do have a vaccination now in place for the pandemic, we do not have the vaccination yet for climate change. And that is the bigger reality. That is the reality that we cannot avoid, come what, with all the emission targets that the world is setting up. I think the tipping point is going to be there sooner than expected. So the point is that we need to look at how, as practitioners, we define our practice in these kind of uncertain times. And how do we look at temperature rise, which is inevitable, which is now going to hit the 1.5 degrees in next few years. Today's newspaper says it could be as soon as 5 years. Imagine living with disasters day in and day out. And so what would be the role of an architect in that kind of scenario? How do you really, look at design interventions, design solutions that are helping people? And I know Iftekhar touched upon this, helping people not just survive, but also begin to adapt and thrive in spite of these kind of changing circumstances, these unpredictable circumstances. And I think the same applies to these migrant workers who also, live with such uncertainties. And what came out of the presentation that you just saw, and my own experience on post-disaster housing, is, the factors that need to be taken into consideration are very different from what we have learned in our colleges, in our institutions about, the client relationship, the client professional relationships, and fees, and how do you provide architectural services. I think here we are looking at a completely new dimension. Also, we are looking at a population base which is at the bottom of the pyramid. So there are challenges there. We are also looking at external circumstances, which I already mentioned are challenging. So in my opinion, these are challenges of time and resources. There is a sense of urgency. Iftekhaar shared that graph that after the initial honeymoon, there is distress and people are without homes. So it's not a question of adding a home. It is a question of survival and, finding a place where you can take refuge. There is also a time of, there is also the factor of affordability. How do we match those needs, match those affordable benchmarks, because not just that we have to provide at scale, but we also have to provide for the possibilities of families. And you saw that in pictures, the families to be able to expand and to build on that, and not be just left with one kind of a structure that they cannot afford to do anything about. And then, he ended this presentation with Build Back Better. And for me, what is better really mean is a question. How do we as architects look at better? Is it about better looking houses, or is it better from a community perspective? And that would completely change the whole game. For me, better is about making them less vulnerable. Considering that disasters are a cyclic process, considering that we have to now live with disasters and in coming times, we need to look at building back better as something making our habitat, our housing as less vulnerable. What we are also seeing, and it was again very apparent in the presentation, was the failure of many models. I think the responsibility of post-disaster housing as against any other private housing is somehow assumed that of the government. And when government steps in, they will look at numbers, they will look at World Bank money or UN money, and then they will just hire out some contractors, and there will be pilferage. And you will see at the end of the day, either people don't get houses in time, or they'll get houses as small as that fisherman community in Chennai. So how do we therefore look at models that can work at scale? Because yes, there is an urgency. How can we look at models that provide the agency to the people? People need to take the decisions, people need to make their choices. They may not be able to afford it completely. The money may come from outside, but is there a model where, while giving the funding from outside, we can still give the freedom to people to be able to make houses of their choice and make them safe, against future disasters? I think these are some of these dilemmas and contradictions that we have faced on the ground over the last 2 decades. And I just thought I'll share with you a few pictures, and I'll go through that rapidly so that if there are questions, love to answer that. So as let me share my screen, and then I can maybe speak on that. One moment, please. Oops. Yeah, I hope this is visible.
Yes, sir.
So yeah. So first, of course, is the factor of community-led, knowledge-driven. These become kind of the primary starting points. And please, I'm not giving you all the factors that go in. It will take me more than an hour to do that. But I'd like to highlight the ones which are, I think, critical or super critical for a post-disaster housing, that is bringing in that ownership of people, the agency of people. Okay, I can't move my slides. Okay, right. So this was from 2001, and we started our work after the Gujarat earthquake, and here, of course, there was large-scale damage. Some 13,000 people had died. Hundreds of thousands of houses had collapsed, and this is an area which is not prone to earthquakes. So there was negligible knowledge of earthquakes in this community. So keep that in mind, because that became an important factor for us. So what we had to bring together to make it a community-led program is a whole lot of factors that perhaps as architects and engineers, we don't get to learn in our schools and colleges. Of course, now maybe there are professors like Iftekhaar who may be able to share that experience, but back in my time, I think it was very classic and Puritan kind of approaches. So the larger ecosystem is, how do you build trust? How do you build that trust as an external agency with people who have lost? How do you prioritize housing reconstruction along with other needs like livelihood, like their needs for health and educational care? How do you create that that ownership at that village level? And we found that it was when we look at their own traditional practices and we demonstrate how a knowledge-driven approach can be brought into a house which is or a design that can be acceptable to them, yet be seismically strong. And we are looking at a post-earthquake scenario. And in the process, looking at sustainability. So how do you build community capacity in this whole process, and let the community take the driver's seat? So the whole process, and I didn't want to show all the pictures here, the whole process was built on, was focused on building community knowledge more than the physical infrastructure, because that is what communities could do. They could make the houses. So we as architects, we as planners were focusing more on the knowledge transfer part. So, keep that in mind, And then how do you train in earthquake resistant construction? How do you bring in this conviction that it can be disaster resistant and yet it can be affordable? Because there is this common thinking that, oh, well, if you want to make it disaster resistant, you have to spend much more money for this. But it's actually not true. It can be intelligently incorporated in these costs. Moving quickly to another example, western part of India, desert area, you can see the sand dunes, but now experiencing flooding every 2 years. First time they experienced flood in 200 years was in 2006. Loss of 139 lives, 50,000 homeless. Now there, the traditional housing practices are based on high temperatures, as well as the phenomena of sandstorms. So the houses are built in circular fashion. They're called dhanis, if you are from that part of the country or region. And then they have very thick adobe walls, which allow for insulation. Now, if I look at it from a flood perspective, these are not the best possible factors. So what I'm trying to say is that you need to question traditional practices also, not just get carried away by the romance of these classical approaches. I think as professionals, we need to take charge. And that is what, we looked at traditional houses, but then how can you incorporate flood resistant features in these kind of examples, in these kind of housing, And our post-disaster housing in these arid areas retained some of the traditional ones. The windstorms are the sandstorms are always there, so circular design is necessary. Interestingly, we looked at roofing structures. These roofing structures, the roof material you can see is same in the picture above and below. What we found was the traditional practice of using the local weed in housing, in roofing, was very, very interesting. It had very high surface tension, which meant that if there were droplets of water, because this is an arid region, so there's not much water, droplets of water could flow away, but the air circulation could be retained, which is not there in a concrete roof or in a GI type of roof. And this is available free. So, communities can replenish it 2 years without a cost. And so we thought that was a very sophisticated design. And we spoke to some of the engineering experts there, and with their help, we could actually retain some of those traditional ones while actually ensuring that it is earthquake, which is flood resistant. So because of that research on who does what and our role getting redefined in this particular case, as architects, we were on the knowledge transfer bit. We could actually move people from their whole aspiration, like, we need a pakka house, we need a house that looks good, like a concrete structure, which they see in movies, in cities, to stick to their own traditional design, yet retain the qualities that come with, all the modern, so-called modern structures that are there. And we've done this in urban housing, in rehousing. This is in Chennai, that where hot and humid climate requires circulation, yet this plinth cover has to be provided. I think Iftekhaar spoke about it. I will not go in. This was after the 2010 floods in Ladakh, Leh, and again, housing here is completely different. In Assam, we had to actually pull back traditional practices that the Mishing tribe in those areas have been practicing. Yet, people have this aspiration of making concrete houses, which actually makes them more vulnerable. So you remember we spoke about building back better, but actually, when communities are not given that choice, when government thinks that they have to provide, or the external agency they provide, they actually create more vulnerabilities than reducing them. So when communities are in charge, they make houses that they know will help them survive. And, and we can see that how they have adapted themselves to floods year after year. And this particular housing work that we did has survived 7 floods so far, and not an iota of damage to these houses. Then moving on quickly to some other factors, and I've spoken about them to you already, but I'll take maybe another 5-7 minutes to speak about affordability, time, and simplicity. And here we are looking at, again, the time factor, which is after the Nepal earthquake in 2015. How can we make houses and transition houses that can provide a roof under each head, above each head, in the shortest possible time? And so we built about 2,000 shelters in less than 5 months after the earthquake. When I say we built, we just made prototypes. And the whole effort of the Seeds architecture team was not to build houses on the ground, but to actually work on the drawing boards, taking inputs from the people to make it as simple as possible so that people can do these houses themselves. And if you look at these structures, these are simple in terms of the message they are giving. They are basically tent structures, but you take the structures out of them, the columns out of it, making it simple for people to understand. And fair enough, across the country in Nepal, in the given short time, we could actually build about 2,500 structures which communities built, completely. All we did was, this is my colleague Akash speaking to communities. These are all house owners sitting in front of him, the one in the red t-shirt, explaining what needs to be done, what is important, and making things simple as an architect, so that it's the people who architect their homes and not us. And for that, you need to create that messaging, that simplicity that requires. And look here, how families got involved, how families sourced material. And all we did was maintain a monitoring role, which ensured that they had the right material at the right time. They did the right curation of cement, and they did the right plaster, and how to split bamboo. And, quickly the livelihood resources were taken care of. And at the same time, large number of houses came up in a very, very short time. The last bit I want to speak about is linkages, enablement, and governance. So while we speak about what people can do and how do we harness that energy from people, we also need to look what kind of conditions do we need to create as externals, as governments. How do we create the right linkages, the right enablement, so that this kind of a housing is possible. In Bihar, after the 2008 floods, what we did was create these shelter hubs, we call them, which were essentially like a training center, create a prototype, create exhibition space, and some area where people can meet. Prototypes could explain, and there were a whole variety of prototypes. This is just one of those pictures where people could actually touch and feel how their house would look like, and what would be the cost of such a house before they could take a decision as to what they would want. At the same time, the government stepped in. The highest level of technical people that we know of stepped in to actually ensure that there are guidances, there are the BOQs which are made available to people to be able to make choices, the right choices, for being able to make houses that are safe. So all that gets converted into simple designs where people can look at options, do their own costing, and be able to take decisions that best meet their needs. And so that has been our journey for, I wouldn't say 18 years now. This is a bit dated. It's now almost 20, 21 years. And we've worked across the geographies with a whole lot of shelter work. But we are still learning. And that is the point that I wanted to tell you. We, as professionals, need to keep our ears and eyes and minds open if we really want to make this post-disaster housing work the way we would want to. So thank you very much. I'll stop sharing here.
Thank you, Manu sir. So I really like your idea about stressing on the important factors of design, such as affordability, less effect on the environment. And here I want to press on one more point. And now we have technology, but still the architects are running after complex design. They're using the technology to deliver more complex design. That those designs might not, perform well. They might be very costly, and obviously not at all vernacular in nature. So instead, we should use this technology to do the analysis in advance on the digital building. First, make the building digital, do the analysis, earthquake analysis, structural analysis. What is the impact going to be on the environment for sustainable design? So in that way, technology can also help to achieve these good designs. So thank you, sir, for the presentation. Now I'll just share my screen to move on to our next part. Yeah, so at Capricot, we have few training programs also which focus on BIM, and this is what the technology I was mentioning, that we can use this BIM for doing the analysis before the construction and measure the impact of a building. So one is this BIM for Design program. This is specially designed for architects, and it is as per the architect's design workflow. And we cover all the softwares: Revit, Navisworks, Autodesk Docs, BIM Collaborate Pro, Dynamo, Format, Insight, and some certain BIM standard. So if there is any training inquiry, then you can email us at connect@capricot.com. So this program is basically for the individual professionals who wants to switch their career in BIM. And secondly, we have this Capricot BIM Guru program. This is for the corporate offices, complete architectural firms who wants to switch all their workflows into BIM. So we provide basically the training and troubleshooting and content. So when you're doing a project on BIM, so we help the firms to deliver the project. So again, you can send your email inquiries at connect@capricot.com. Okay, now we'll move to Q&A session. So there are a few questions in the Q&A box. So I'm going to pick up a few. And if there is any question left, we can, we're going to email you the answers. And if you have any questions, then you can later on also you can write email us at connect@capricot.com. So I'll just pick up a few questions. Okay, this question is from one question is from Farhan Khan. So he's asking, sir, if you can tell us more about the relation between resiliency and the cost factor, as most of the times we have the cost factor in India, means as the cost increases, the strength and resilience increases. But working in Indian context, what are your picks that we can make a good resilient buildings in low cost, which can perform longer? So he belongs to Eastern UP. So
do you want me to go first? I can go.
Yes, sir.
I think Manu touched on it already quite a bit, I think. Look, for me, cost, I tend to rationalize cost in terms of the benefits you'll get. It's if you spend more now, you'll spend less later. Okay, let's think of it like that. I think there was some calculation that if you spend $1 extra, you save more than $7 to $8 on reconstruction costs. So that is how you should look at, cost effectiveness. So the word low cost doesn't have any sense. What is low for you is not low for someone else. It's a relative term. So let's not go there. I think let's talk about cost effectiveness, and effectiveness should be rationalized in terms of the benefits that you get. So in the context of India, if you're thinking that, okay, I'm going to build something, and I think someone also posted a comment saying that buildings kill people, earthquakes and cyclones don't kill people, but it's badly constructed buildings, that's what kills people. So I think losing a human life, you cannot put a value on a human life. It's invaluable. There's no monetary cost associated with it. So you're losing such invaluable resources. So I think that is how you should understand about cost. So I think it's well worth investing that extra little bit to build better and safer. Better in the sense that not beautiful, aesthetically pleasing and all that. Yes, that is also important, but that is perhaps secondary in this particular case when we are, confronted by all kinds of hazards that can actually not only take away lives, but also take away all the resources that we've invested in our homes. So I think that is how you should look at costs. I think, so I don't have a ready-made solution for you that you spend this much and you get a better house. The other thing I just want to very quickly touch on is that some of the examples that we gave and even Manu gave, they are actually in rural areas. In the urban context, there are massive challenges, particularly in mega cities like Delhi and Mumbai and Dhaka and other cities in South Asia. It's very, very challenging to do it. And I think perhaps for students to think about it, you might have to go back to the owner-driven principles that I was trying to touch on, that you cannot go and just build these 4-story, one-room walk-ups. but you allow people to co-design, to get involved in the process according to their affordability, what they can do over time, whether they can build incrementally, when they can just have some part of the shelter or the house that they can live in and adapt through modules. And that is perhaps, Farhad, Mr. Farhad, where your ideas about the technology might come in, that you might have to incorporate more technological solutions to urban housing problems. So, yeah. That's it. I think I saw many other questions, but I think I'll rest a little bit.
Yes, sir. So we have one interesting question from Dhruva Podia. So listening to these presentations from architectural perceptions, it may work well only for that paradigm. At the other, structural and aesthetics aspects are equally valued. Indigenous knowledge and amalgamated with modern engineering assessments are much for designing resilient structures that are safe and livable. How and when such efforts are you feel to be incorporated in your learnings? So we would like to for this.
You want to go, Manu? Have a go at it?
Okay. I'll let you take some more rest. So, well,
I have
no,
many points to add to it, but please, it's your turn. I think.
I think the answer is in the question itself. So in some way, what I have learned from the field is that we as professionals sometimes don't go that extra mile to see the fusion of traditional practices and modern design principles. And I think that's our failure, not the failure of the system. And I believe that it is very much possible. The most beautiful designs, the ones which I showed you from Assam, for example, and similar examples that Iftekhaar showed from other parts of the world, are beautiful designs in terms of how communities view them. How communities, it's for their surroundings, their day-to-day needs and sense of aesthetics and their relationship to nature, which needs to get captured. And so I think the point that we need to let go is this very classic approach of I am the sculptor, I am the artist, and therefore it's my design. I think that's the one that is being challenged here. And to the extent that we can really put our ears on the ground, I think we will be able to create beautiful harmony out of what community needs and what we have learned and what we can bring to the world. But I'll keep it at that. Maybe Iftekhaar can give us more practical points on that.
No, look, this is a topic I can talk a lot about. I think, first of all, we have to understand the context. Okay, context is the most important thing. And we have to understand this tradition, culture, indigenous knowledge, all these are evolving. It is not something static. These are dynamic processes which adapt and change over time. And there's so many pressures also. Pressures of urbanization, pressures of climate change, pressures of deforestation, pressure of lack of resources. I can just tell you that I showed you those photographs of bamboo in Bangladesh. That is a resource they cannot get anymore. Before they could just go to the forest and just cut them. Now they're captured by interest groups who make profit by selling them and people can't afford them. And they're also scarce because of urbanization and deforestation. So things are changing. People have to embrace new solutions, new ideas, and we have to understand the reality of urbanization in countries like India. So I think we have to be a bit more flexible in trying to understand it. And people also have aspirations. When as an architect, we think, oh, how beautiful this vernacular tradition is, how romantic. But then that is a reality which they want to leave behind. They want to move forward. They want to aspire for a different kind of future. And we have to recognize that also and make space for that within our, design support that we give. I don't say like we design buildings for them, but we support the processes that they aspire towards by providing and facilitating that process so that they can get the ideas together, put it all together, we brainstorm together. It's a co-production process, really. So I think that that notion of indigenous knowledge, yes, you just look at a country like Australia, we had indigenous populations, the Aboriginals living here 60,000 years beforehand. This is where they were. And now they're all gone. I think they are here, but the kind of houses they live in are regular housing. And where is that tradition? Where is it? How do you recover it? And I'm a bit scared of this neo-revivalism notion. I think India is famous for it. They change the names of the cities and all that. I think there's a dangerous edge to it. I think I don't want to go there in great detail, but I fear that this kind of neo-revivalism has an issue which is not relevant to the context at certain times. So I think in Australia, if you're going to build housing for indigenous people, you would have to build housing. And so I'm distinguished between what is indigenous, what is vernacular, to what is local. And what is local makes sense to people because they are accustomed to it, they live with it. And if they don't have the resources to go back to that beautiful past, so be it. We have to realize those resource constraints and work with that. Does that make sense, I think? It's a difficult issue. I can keep going on about this.
Okay, thank you, sir. So I think I'll pick up just one more question. This one looks interesting from Mahiyar Habibi. So thanks, Dr. Ahmed, for your informative presentation. One of the significant problems facing post-disaster reconstruction projects is the lack of client satisfaction. What is your suggestion for considering client values, example, cultural appropriateness or in recovery projects?
Maybe I should go, since that question was directed to you, and Manu, you can also add your views to it. I think we have just been talking about it. The problems with many of these projects is that the actual users and the future owners are excluded from the process of designing and implementing them. They are given a key at the end of the project. Here is the house, you move into it. But I'm talking about a completely different process when people are engaged right from the beginning, or at least they are aware, the information is shared, what is going to happen in that place, what we are doing and what you can do, what you can contribute and what you can take over. And look, there's just so many different approaches. And nowadays, I think many organizations, I was just talking to someone from CARE in Vanuatu this morning, and now they have a model called self-recovery process. And they say that we have been doing housing for people. It's just a waste of resources. It's so expensive and it never satisfies people. Every time they get these houses, they say like, this is me, this is not working, this is not. So now we have decided, we go to communities, say, what can you do? What do you want to do? And you tell us. And there are so many other approaches. I have colleagues who now work with owner-driven reconstruction processes around the world when people decide. And once you do that, then there's more satisfaction. I showed you a slide that they have decided, they have made the decision, they have made the choices. And whether you like the choices as this architect who think that, it should be like that, sorry, you relinquish. Let's listen to them and kind of work with that and see what improvements that we can bring in that process. That is our contribution. Maybe you want to add something to that, Manu, maybe.
No, I think you've really hit the nail on its head. I mean, I think the point is that the whole discourse on owner-driven is that you restore that ownership of the people, and once you do that, the client satisfaction is actually not at all a factor, because it is their design, their aspirations that we are trying to address. So I think this whole the whole client value thing becomes a very different narrative when we are looking our role as an enabler and not as a provider. And I think that's what we need to keep in mind. Yeah.
Mr. Farah, there's one question I saw. I'd just like to pick up on it if you have a minute. is that someone mentioned that, look, we are not, in the context of your competition, we're not talking about cyclones and earthquakes, we're talking about recovery from COVID-19. So I think I would stress that the principles that we were talking about, this people-centered, owner-driven, co-production, co-designing processes, they apply across the board, whatever the disaster is, whether it's a global pandemic or a localized flood. Okay, so I think you can take on board that suite of lessons.
Thanks a lot, sir. So I think now we can move to the next or the end part of the today's session. So I would like to invite Chakre sir to give a vote of thanks to our esteemed presenters.
So I can only see passion from both our speakers. And like I was talking to Manu a few days back, and he was telling how during his undergraduate studies and in canteen, he decided to do something what he's doing today. And something similar Iftekhaar has been doing for ages. And only we feel very confident and safe when things are with such thought process, with the complete people-centric approach. That's what I see as one of the very most important theme in both their presentation. And I think it's a very, very relevant topic. And as Manu also mentioned, that the frequency of disasters, especially natural disasters, are increasing. So we have to be ready. Of course, we have to work on both the sides, ensuring we do achieve our climate targets. But then we know things will take their own time. But meanwhile, we have to be ready with natural disasters. And we feel very safe with such thought process from both our speakers, Iftekhaar and Manu, has shared, and which is a completely people-centric approach. So I'd like to thank them both for sharing their so many years of research and experience with all the participants. And I'm sure all the participants would cherish what they have seen today. And of course, we'll also share the recording if anyone would like to get into more, hear them again and understand some of the nitty-gritties which they have shared. And I'd like to thank all the participants also for coming and attending. And please do write back to us. And if you like to see more such presenters or anyone you like to recommend to come and share with us, we'll be more than happy to put our effort to bring them to everyone. So I'd like to thank Iftekhaar. I'd like to thank Manu for sharing such good thoughts and their experiences. So thank you, everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we can leave now.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes.
Yep. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.